Unit 1. Unit 1 is referring to as foundations. And I'm going to do a short introduction to the unit. I'm going to talk about the nature of belief, talk about what the experts say about this paranormal subject matter. I'm going to talk about how to become more of an expert yourself and why that's important. So let's jump right in. All right, so the world's a pretty incredible place, right? You've got people, billions of people buzzing around with jobs and hobbies and kids and houses and cars and mortgages and diseases and plans and dreams, all going a million different ways. And for most people, there's enough there just, living their life, trying to satisfy everybody around them and their needs. There's enough there to keep people quite busy. And I really find that, that's actually one of the primary reasons why a lot of people don't spend the time to really investigate these sorts of topics, is because everybody's busy enough trying to just live their life and pay the mortgage without having to worry about this sort of stuff. So I guess I looked at my brain aneurysm as a gift in some ways, because although it damaged my brain and makes it basically not possible for me to do the work I used to do, it left me with enough faculties and some time to be able to look into some of these topics that I find interesting. So I guess every cloud is a silver lining, right? So as I said earlier, science has always been a passion of mine. It's always been essentially a hobby. If I was sitting on the beach in the summer taking a break, I spent a certain amount of time reading Robert Ludlum and learning about spy versus spy. But really, the further I went along, the more I found myself reading Whitley Strieber and UFO stories, or learning about deeper science, Stephen Hawking, learning about black holes, etc., etc., Brian Greene, on and on and on. So I always had, most of my reading was out of curiosity to learn more about the world. And what I found is, just generally in life, really, not just sitting on the beach reading, is coming across glitches in the world. Basically, things that occur that simply can't be explained by the rules of science. The ESP, for example, or any number of things that you might put under the heading of the paranormal. They really didn't fit into what I considered to be the way the world works, which is essentially a giant, complex machine. That's what science teaches us. That's what Newton said. That's what Galileo said. That's what all the great scientists have said, is that, for every action there's a reaction, and really everything that occurs, whether it's microscopic chemical reaction or whether it's two galaxies colliding, all these things have to do with objects and materials and matter and forces, and that you can explain everything in the universe, every action, everything that happens, you can explain at some level by talking about, forces and matter. And so essentially we live in a physical universe, and I couldn't understand how those things could possibly happen. I'm talking about things like near-death experiences, reincarnation, etc. And so I was always disturbed by that fact, and I always assumed that science would figure it out. And of course there are a lot of scientists who have looked into this, and many books have been written on the topic. They all seem to come to the same conclusion, essentially, that no, this stuff doesn't really happen. It looks like it does, but it really doesn't, because it's impossible for it to happen. I mean, most scientists start with the premise that it's simply impossible, and then they spend their time trying to explain why it seems to happen. Here I am waiting, and have been for 30 years, 40 years, for science to kind of figure this stuff out and come up with a plausible explanation of why so many people have come so close to death, or have actually died, they would say, had an incredible experience and come back from the dead, and why those experiences are so similar and why they're so mystical. I've never been satisfied with the explanations that I've gotten from traditional science. So let's go back, speaking of traditional science, let's go back to the early 20th century, back to people like Niels Bohr and Max Planck. They were saying something 100 years ago that still resonates, but it hasn't yet been really integrated into science. And what they were saying was that consciousness was somehow fundamental. Consciousness was an incredibly important part of reality. Not just an important part of being a person, not just an important part of being a human being, but an important part of reality, the actual physical structure of reality. Right? And Einstein wasn't a big fan of that theory when he was younger, but it seemed to grow on him as he got older. And then by the time he got, late in his life, he got to the point where he sort of threw up his hands and said, okay, yes, I'll admit it. There is something about consciousness that can't be ignored, and something about consciousness that's important. But I'm too old to figure it out. So I hope some of the physicists who come after me will do that work. I love some of the Einstein quotes. One of the quotes he used when he was a younger man, when he was first introduced to quantum mechanics, which is a whole study in the fundamental nature of the universe, the fundamental nature of matter. And we're going to get into that in a few lectures from now. But one of the important aspects of quantum mechanics is that everything is probabilistic. Everything has a certain probability of happening. That's really profound, although it doesn't sound profound just stating it that way. But one thing that Einstein said was, God doesn't play dice with the universe. That's how he sort of rationalized the fact that he thought quantum mechanics was a bunch of crap. So God doesn't play dice with the universe. Well, by the time Einstein was getting ready to pass on, he relented and said, apparently, yes, God does play dice with the universe, and we're just going to have to learn to deal with that fact. So we'll get to more about quantum mechanics, but the point that I really want to make here is 100 years ago, the greats in physics, the greats in science, had figured out that this thing called consciousness, which no one has still yet fully defined, is somehow fundamentally involved with how the world works. But science today hasn't really made any progress at all in figuring it out over the last 100 years. As a matter of fact, if you go into science class today in high school and in the first year or so of college, you won't hear any discussion about the fact that consciousness is potentially integral to what makes things work. And a lot of people, a lot of experts in various fields of study are ignoring the fact that consciousness is involved and pretend that it isn't. And I think it's not because they're ignorant of the fact, it's that they understand that there's no explanation for it, and that if they really acknowledge that consciousness is involved in a lot of these things, it really sort of throws a wrench in all the work that they're doing. So we'll get to that going forward, but I guess I just want to let people know that if you have this sense that these paranormal kinds of things really exist, and if you have that sense, but you're also disturbed that science is completely oblivious to it, I want you to understand science is not completely oblivious to it. It's just that science hasn't embraced it and really researched it very well. We'll talk a bit more about maybe why that's the case. Anyway, so I started doing all this work. I read all these books, and what I was really the whole point of what I was trying to do is get to the bottom of what science had figured out. I assumed that maybe science had learned a lot more than I had known, and that all I really needed to do is spend the time to read the books and do the internet searches to really see what the state of the art was. What I found is, no, science really hadn't made much progress, and that it wasn't my imagination, that they didn't have the answers. And that was kind of disappointing to me because science was always an important aspect of my whole life. So what I decided was, I'm a smart enough guy to make sense of information, and I'll go do my own searches. And so the beautiful thing is, we're talking about the 2000s here. The internet has essentially all the accumulated knowledge of mankind at our fingertips. And so I started pressing buttons and seeing what happened. What I found was pretty incredible. What I found was that a gigantic amount of information exists relating to the paranormal. And a lot of this material is scientific in nature. A lot of this material was gathered using, very, very rigid protocols, exactly the same kinds of experimental protocols that you would use in any branch of science. So it turns out that the stuff I found wasn't just written by wackos, hiding in a cave in wherever and meditating. It was written by people who had graduated from places like Caltech and Stanford and MIT, but just had gone into consciousness studies or paranormal studies. So I was very happy to see there was a lot of material. I was surprised that really, if I had taken the time 20 or 30 years ago to really look, I would have gotten a lot of the answers to the questions I had. I thought that no one had really looked into this, and they really have. Mainstream science is not, but someone has, and it's all been published and it's all available. So originally, my search was really to figure out whether this stuff was real. And it turns out that there's no doubt that it's real in my mind, and I'll share some of the information that I found. So my search really changed to rather than figure out whether it's real, is to figure out more about the exact nature of it and how it works. And so that's how I changed my focus. So the idea was to learn, as I said earlier, to learn enough about these various different pieces and the research that's gone into them to see if we can put together a description of how reality works that we can compare against what science says on that subject, and really compare the two and see who really has a story that seems to fit the data better. Okay, so that's really what I really did. Very often when I talk to people about this sort of thing, they ask me about God and whether this material has led me to any understanding or belief, good or bad, in terms of God. And I really not planning to spend much time talking about that, but I will say that most of what I discovered, especially in regard to religious topics, has shown me that if you're looking to find answers about how the world works and how reality works, you're not going to find it in any religion or any of the major religions, organized religions. You may find it, when talking to a Buddhist monk and learning how to meditate, you may learn a lot. But if you're walking into any of the church of your choice, really what I've found is, although I used to think that all of these religions were really fabricated by scared men thousands of years ago who either wanted to control people or were afraid of dying, or both. That's really what I thought. I actually, upon looking at it now after all the work that I've done, I think what I would say is the root of every religion is probably an actual, real paranormal experience, a real mystical experience. But that was 1,000 or 2,000 or 10,000 years ago. And in the intervening time, there's been so many rules and so much dogma built up around the basic, original core idea that it doesn't make sense anymore. In other words, Christianity may have been based on real, actual, factual things that happened that were mystical in nature, but so much junk has gone on in the last 2,000 years, so that you can barely recognize the roots of Christianity walking into a Christian church today. So what I would say is, although people can make their choices freely to go to church or not, and to choose a religion, based on what I've found, I don't think anything useful comes out of any of the major religions in terms of understanding the nature of reality. Okay, so I put this together really for three different types of people. One group is the group of people who are active searchers today. And probably I'm not going to say too much that surprises any of these people. As a matter of fact, it might bore them because I'm going to spend time explaining things to people who don't really have any training or experience or knowledge in this area. And so I may go a little slow for those sorts of people, but so be it. Be patient with me. The second group are, maybe you would just call them skeptics. And my My objective there is to throw the facts out there, let those skeptics know what's actually been done and what's actually been proved. And if they want to remain skeptical, that's fine. But at least I want them to remain skeptical, knowing some facts, rather than simply assuming this is all craziness. The last group are people who are curious and who have a sense that something odd is going on, and maybe there's more to life than they think. And I guess I want to say to those people, you're right, there is more going on. I think this may be the largest group that could be interested in hearing these lectures, and it's really to those people that I'm probably spending most of my time trying to talk to, because I think they're, first of all, they're going to get the most out of it, and they're going to put the most value into it. So those are the three groups that I think we're probably going to get some benefit out of this. All right, so I just took a quick break there for a second. The next section here is to talk about the nature of belief. I guess I really find that if I'm going to be talking about some things that are somewhat unbelievable, which I am, trust me, I think it's helpful if people understand their own biases and their own current belief system, so that they can try to figure out whether there's room to believe something else. And so talking a bit about why we believe certain things and whether it's easy or hard to change our mind and accept a new belief, talking about those things I think is probably important, probably helpful. So let's go right at it. So for starters, well, you know what? I think maybe what we'll do is let me tell you a quick story, because I think stories are an important part of what we're going to do here with these lectures. Let me tell you a quick story, and then we can talk about belief. So, this is a true story. There was a young boy who lived on a farm with his brothers and his mother and his father, and he had grandparents that lived in the area. And one night he was in bed, and his three brothers were in the same bedroom, and they were all asleep, and he heard something, was disturbed somehow, and he woke up, and at the foot of his bed was his grandfather. And his grandfather asked him, how he was doing today, and whether he did all his chores, and asked him about the horses and the chickens and the other animals on the farm, and they just talked the way they normally do. And after a few minutes, the grandfather said, well, listen, I want you to know that I'm going to be leaving for some time, and I want you to know that I love you, and I'm okay, and I will see you again, but I'll be gone for a while. And I don't know whether the boy asked him any questions at that point or not, but their conversation ended up running its course. The boy went back to sleep. The grandfather left, and the boy got up in the morning and went downstairs, and his mother and father were in the kitchen as they normally are. Potbelly stove was burning, and they were sitting there with their cups of coffee, planning out the daily chores. And the boy said to his mother and father, I talked to Grampy last night. And they looked at him, and he said, Grampy said he was going to be going away, and where's Grampy going? How come, what's going on? And the mother and the father kind of looked at each other and really didn't know what to say, because, as you probably would guess, given the nature of these lectures, the grandfather was dead. The grandfather actually had died the night before in a car accident on the way home from his job as a night watchman. As you might guess, I know these people. This little boy is my uncle. My father is one of the brothers sleeping in the room, and of course the mother and father are my grandmother and grandfather. And these are the most down-to-earth people you'd ever want to meet. My father was the most down-to-earth, not woo-woo kind of guy, just very, very sort of salt-of-the-earth, straightforward guy, did not tend towards exaggeration or wild stories. But he told me this story many, many, many times as I was growing up. And of course, this kind of story happens all the time. And almost every family has an example of a story like this in it. But it's funny, very often people have a story like this in their family, but they never really try to figure it out and try to understand how could this possibly be true. Because, a scientist might say, well, the little boy heard a siren, or it was just a coincidence, or he must have overheard someone say something about his grandfather dying and he had this crazy dream. I mean, so scientific thinkers never have a shortage of excuses to be able to explain away something incredible. And so that's what they would probably do in this case. And I know that because I was a materialist thinker for the first 90% of my life. And that's exactly what I would have done. I would have said, well, yeah, Dad's got a bit of an imagination, or Dad's brother has a bit of an imagination, and maybe they made the whole thing up, or whatever. These are my family, and I'm thinking that. So, anyways, I guess I want to say that if you have stories like this in your family, you really ought to pay attention. So let's get back to the original point. What we were talking about is the nature of belief. And, what do you believe? What don't you believe? Well, so let's start with some obvious stuff. Examples in history about incredible things that no one believes that turn out to be true. The most obvious one was, whether the earth was round or flat, whether the earth revolved around the sun or whether the sun revolved around the earth, whether the earth was the center of the universe or not. I mean, all these things have been under discussion for thousands of years. People like Galileo were making pronouncements about how the universe worked, how the solar system worked for decades, I think probably 100 years or more, before people would really sort of believe it. And the point here isn't that people didn't believe. The point is that scientists who should know better, who should only be looking at the data, only be looking at the facts and following the facts, scientists who theoretically you can trust to be objective, weren't. They were too caught up in their own mental picture of how they believed the universe worked, what they were taught, and they were so caught up in it that they spent thousands and thousands of hours coming up with odd mathematical formulas to be able to explain the strange motion of the planets in the sky. I mean, I don't know if you understand how orbital mechanics works or astronomy, but if you watch Mercury or other planets, they will be moving across the sky a little bit every night, and then all of a sudden they will turn around, they will move backwards, and then they will turn around and move forward again. That's called retrograde motion. And it's never been understood. It wasn't understood, 1,000 years ago why that was going on. People like Copernicus came up with a theory that said those planets aren't moving backward. The problem is that we are both circling around the sun, and that planet's relative motion is backwards because of our relative motion of the two orbits going around the sun. Scientists, that was the simple explanation for why things went into retrograde motion. But rather than believe that simple explanation, scientists came up with complicated equations to explain the retrograde motion so that they wouldn't have to change their worldview. That was true 1,000 years ago, and it's true today. Scientists will break their backs to try to come up with convoluted stories, convoluted rationales as to why a certain thing happens so they can get it to fit into their worldview. After all, they've invested thousands and thousands of hours in study, many thousands of dollars in tuition to get this education that they've got, and now they've got a good job working for a good company doing whatever science they're doing. To acknowledge that what they believe in is broken and that science is flawed would be to really put their entire life at risk. It makes them very uncomfortable. So I guess what I want to say is, would you be one of those people who would say to Galileo, "I'll go away, that's just retrograde motion, I've got this nice complicated formula that can explain it"? Or would you be one of those people that said, "Show me your data. Wow, isn't that interesting? Then maybe you've got something here." You know what? Everyone would like to believe that they would believe the data and believe Galileo or believe Copernicus. But you know what? If you really think about it, You might not. So, step one is, would you believe? If given all the information, would you even give yourself a chance to believe? Well, if you're going to be curious and you're going to do the kind of journeying that we're talking about here, you better start getting used to accepting that discomfort. Looking at facts and looking at data, and accept the discomforting possibility that it's going to change your worldview. All right? So, who do you trust today? Do you trust your parents, your spouse, your siblings, your friend, your doctor, your teacher, your preacher, scientists? The majority of people, books, newspapers, TV. I mean, where do you come down on this? And feel like everybody else, you probably have, some combination of all of the above. Back in the 60s and the 70s, when it came to science, everybody would listen to Carl Sagan. He seemed to be the oracle, right? And today we've got a new set of oracles that people like to listen to. The point is, there's no shortage of experts out there, but we're going to get into a minute about the risk of just listening to an expert if they're not really an expert. Let's talk now on just the idea of learning something new and believing something new. The problem here is that, I guess the way I look at it is, beliefs are risky things. I kind of equate this to inviting a stranger into your house to live forever. You've got family there, you've got people that you love living there, people that you want to protect, things that you want to protect. Inviting something new into that environment requires a lot of trust. It requires you to be really, really convinced that it's the right thing to do. And so before you do that, you think twice, 3, 4 times. And people spend, especially when you're getting a little bit older, people have spent their entire lives developing a belief system, developing a set of principles and core values and beliefs in how they believe the world works and what's right, what's wrong, et cetera, et cetera. And that only gets worse as you get older because you get more attached to those beliefs. But I guess what I want to say is that if I understand the desire to make sure that you really truly believe something before you kind of let it sink into your psyche. Because first of all, it requires you probably, if you're going to let something sink into your psyche, it very often is displacing something else that you used to believe and you've come to know and love for a long time. And that's as I said earlier, that's a disorienting thing. So I understand the reticence of doing something like that, but you need to understand that if your primary goal is to keep new things out and protect the things that you've already got, if that's the most important aspect of choosing a belief, well, then you're not going to grow much anymore, and that's totally fine. If you're into doing other things and not into really adjusting the things that you believe in, that's totally cool. On the other hand, if you're trying to get to the bottom of things and really understand things, you better sort of loosen up on that a little bit. You better develop the ability to swap something new for something old. Yes, it's hard. Yes, it's disorienting, but it's really the nature of the beast, and it's something very important to learn how to do. All I can say is understand that everything I say to you, I've had to go through that exact same process. I was totally committed to materialism, to reductionism, before I started this process. I'm a very, very different person in terms of what I believe now than what I was 10 years ago. And that's not to say that you need to believe what I believe. All I'm trying to say is I've had to struggle with those same things. So just understand that when I say things, that these are things that I had to struggle with and that I've been able to sort of, kind of get over that threshold. And so I'm just not throwing crazy things out there and see what I can get you to believe. I'm throwing things out there that I've had to struggle with that I firmly believe are true now. So now the challenge is yours to decide what you're going to let in and what you're going to let out. I just think it's important for people to be aware that they have a set of beliefs and that they're naturally going to want to protect them. But you ought to always be questioning yourself and questioning whether you're refusing to accept something because it is in conflict with what you have as a belief already. And if that's the case, you need to be able to put the belief that you have and the belief that you're considering, you need to be able to put them side by side and compare the two and make a logical choice as to which one's correct. And you shouldn't just defend the one that you've believed in all these years out of loyalty. That's not going to get you anywhere. Okay? Just a suggestion. So, the thing I'd like to talk about now are maybe some tools that you might use to help you decide whether something being told to you is something that you can believe in. Back in the 50s and 60s, there was a show called Dragnet. Jack Webb, Sergeant Friday. And, he'd always say, "Just the facts, ma'am, just the facts." Right? And so that's my mantra, is I'm trying to go with the facts and follow where they lead me. So let's say you hear a story. Let's say if one person tells you a story about the tooth fairy, tells you all kinds of information about how the tooth fairy came and left money and took the tooth, and gee, I didn't see the tooth fairy, but I saw the money and I saw the tooth. I threw the tooth under there and now I have money, and my mother told me it was a fairy and she must have come because now I've got the money, right? Or maybe there's another story about someone tells you about the formulation of an electron and valence levels in an electron. My science teacher told me about it. And here's how it works, right? So here's a couple of stories that you can sit down and decide what's the truth and what's not the truth. What are you going to believe? What are you not going to believe? So my first place to start is whether or not the reporter is credible. Whether or not the person who told you the story is a credible person. Have they lied to you before? Do they have any reason to lie to you now? Do they stand to gain if they get you to believe this thing that sounds crazy? You know, those sorts of things. So really take a look at the credibility of the person, you know, that the story's coming from. And if it's a first-person account, well, then you can directly put it on that person, whether they're making this story up or not. And perhaps you can ask questions to try to get to the bottom of that. Now, if this person is recounting a story, well, now you've got to consider where they got the story from, etc., etc. So there's the whole credibility of the storyteller. Then, is the story reasonable? Does it comport with what you believe to be true? Does the story about the tooth fairy, does that comport with what you believe to be true in general? Do you believe in fairies? Do you have personal experience with fairies? If so, well, then maybe the belief in a tooth fairy is not such a wild idea. On the other hand, if you've never seen any evidence whatsoever of a tooth fairy, and then maybe that says a lot about whether you ought to believe this story. Okay, so is the story reasonable? And the last is it consistent with what other reporters have said about the same topic? This is really, really important because someone may tell you kind of a wild story, but if that same wild story has been told many times before, maybe hundreds of years or thousands of years before, a similar story, similar outcome, maybe that's something you ought to give a little bit of thought to. If multiple people are reporting this over time, and these people aren't connected in any way to each other, then perhaps that's a reason to, give it some extra credence. All right, so those are just some guidelines to use, and maybe they're obvious, maybe they're not, but I would suggest starting there. It's got to be tough for someone who has had a paranormal experience trying to convince other people of it. I mean, imagine it happening to you. How would you convince someone that you died and went and met your dead grandmother and she told you certain things and then you came back? It's hard enough to just believe it yourself. How are you going to be able to convince other people of it? So I guess what I try to do when I'm reading some of these accounts or talking to people about some of these accounts is try to put myself in the position of someone who that might have happened to. And what would I be saying in that situation? And maybe it can make me more sensitive to the problem of how believable this story is or unbelievable it is. The the bottom line is, in many of these situations, there is no tangible proof. There's no hard, tangible evidence. That's problematic. Now, in many research environments, there's a lot of data that is very tangible. We're going to get into that, but a lot of these stories are just that. They're stories that you've got to decide whether you believe the person telling the story, whether the story makes sense to you and comports with what you believe to be even possible, and go from there. And like I said earlier, one of the problems with a lot of experts, scientific experts, commenting about the paranormal is they simply reject the whole possibility of any of this even being possible, because it is simply in violation with what they believe, with how they believe the universe works. And so they actually are ignoring the data and simply going with the fact that it doesn't comport with their view of reality. So when I tell you to compare a story with how you believe reality works, do that, but don't let it overwhelm the fact that you've got data showing you that something is true. Now you just need to figure out whether that data is reliable data. But if I've got reliable data that says something is true, I don't care what the experts say, how the experts say the universe works. I'm going to follow that data and not follow the expert opinion. And eventually, I'm going to have to somehow make sense of that fact and make sense of how this impossible thing happens in a world with rules that say it's impossible. I have to make sense of that somehow at some point. But just throwing away, ignoring that incredible story just because it's violating a rule that someone says is inviolate. That's what I used to do. All right. There's one more rule that I think is in some ways even more important than the 3 rules I just gave you. And that is, a lot of paranormal experiences involve information, gaining information, either from a dead relative or from some other entity. And what I'm finding is a great rule of thumb is if I were able to learn information from this source that I had no way of knowing and that they had no way of knowing, that's a very, very powerful statement, and that goes a long way to me of being proof. So let me just give you a story to sort of highlight this. Again, best I can tell, this is a true story. This came from a book written by a medium, a psychic medium, and she tells a story about these 2 brothers. Actually, one brother. This guy Fred came, and I'm just going to make these names up because I forget what the actual names were. Fred came to her and said that he would like to have a reading. And so she gave him a reading, and as very often happens, she told him, a lot of interesting facts about his life. She told him that he had a brother, that they grew up on a farm in the Midwest, and that she saw cows and a barn, and gave him all sorts of information. But he was still kind of skeptical. And so he kind of went along with it, but was waiting for her to give him more. So she started talking about the brother, and she started to get a sense that he was believing her, but was still kind of holding back. And she goes, well, listen, I've got some specific information you might find interesting. Your brother is telling me that when you were kids, you loved baseball. And when you were kids, you had a brand new baseball, and at some point you lost it and never found it again. And he goes, yeah, that's true, that's right. He goes, did you know the actual truth of the matter is your brother took that baseball? He's like, really? Tell me more. So she goes, well, he took it because he was jealous, and he kind of wanted to stick it to you. He took it and he hid it. And it's still currently hidden on the farm. And this guy, Fred's parents, still owned the farm. So he goes, really, where? And she goes, well, it's in a secret hiding place he had in the barn. And she described exactly where the secret hiding place was in the barn. It was behind a board in some corner of the barn, and she described it to him. And Fred went the next day, went to the barn, or a week later, went to the barn, went to where she described it, pulled off the loose board, and there was the ball that his brother had hidden there years before. So in his mind, that was enough proof to say that she was actually in communication with his brother, and this was tangible evidence because there's no way she could have known about this ball. And the important thing is, he didn't know it either. I mean, some scientific people would say, when you're in this sort of a reading, is that the medium is actually getting information out of you, the living person sitting there. They're either getting you to say something, getting you to agree to something, or they're essentially leading you to give them the information. But the interesting thing about this particular story is Fred didn't know that this ball was there. He didn't know where to look, and neither did the medium. And so she knew something that neither one of those two knew, which is referred to as double blind in the research parlance. So that's some pretty incredible stuff, and to me, that's enough to really believe in this stuff. And there are thousands and thousands of examples like this, some of which I'll get into in further lectures. But there's one thing I wanted to point out here, that there's something even more incredible than the fact that she was able to give him a piece of information that neither one of them knew. My question is, there's only one person, theoretically, that knew where that ball was. And that was Tom, Fred's brother. And Tom had been dead, let's say, 10 years when this reading took place. My question to you is, where was that information stored? While Tom was alive, that information was stored in Tom's brain. That's what a doctor would tell you, what a scientist would tell you. That information was stored in Tom's brain. That's fine. Let's say I agree with that for a minute. My question is, Tom died 10 years ago. That information was buried with him. That information is gone. Where did the medium get this information from, if that information was simply stored in the synapses of Tom's brain? All right? To me, that's the crux of this whole story, and that's the crux of really a lot of this work, a lot of this paranormal work, is that it seems like information is stored somewhere other than the physical brain of the person that we're talking about. Try to wrap your head around that one. And so I believe that stories like this are very, very valuable, because they not only show you that mediums can tell you things that they shouldn't be able to tell you, they can also tell you things that you didn't even know. And they can also tell you things that would be impossible to know, because the only person who knew is now dead. That's incredible stuff. And so we're going to get more to issues like that as we go further through this. But I think it's important to understand that that's the kind of evidence that's out there. Now my question to you is, because remember, we're talking about belief here. My question to you is, all right, so now where do you stand on a story like that? Is it possible for you to believe a story like that? Well, if it's not, then I would suggest you think about what your belief system is and why you can't let something like that in. And I'm not trying to change that in you. I'm trying to make sure that you understand it. If nothing else, when these lectures are over, at least maybe you'll understand yourself better and how you're wired and what you can and can't believe, and more importantly than that, why you can and can't believe it. All right? So let's go on a little bit deeper here. Let's talk about the experts again. I just want to go back to them for just a minute. I talked about the fact that so-called experts, they are experts in their particular field, but they are not particularly expert in the area of paranormal research, and they're not particularly expert in the specific category of paranormal. For example, I've heard interviews about near-death experience, for example, where the person commenting, the expert commenting, isn't really familiar with the bulk of work that's been already been done in NDE research. And in my mind, you can't really have an opinion if you don't even understand the work that's been done and the proofs that are already completed. That's like, I'm not even going to think of an analogy. It doesn't make sense. I think it's obvious. If you don't understand the material, there's no way your opinion means much. So, number one, most experts out there aren't. And that includes skeptics. Very often the skeptics, all they know is the little tiny talking points that they heard on some YouTube channel somewhere about why, NDEs are impossible. Oh, it's because of lack of oxygen, or it's because of whatever. There's a million different possibilities. I don't want to go through them all, but the point is let's say half a dozen different talking points, and the skeptic will know what the talking points are. The question is, will they understand a level deeper than that and a level deeper than that? Typically, no. And so, if you happen to be talking to a very open-minded skeptic, someone who is willing to listen and willing to listen to facts, that's awesome. You can give them the facts. You can change their mind. But when I use the term skeptic, I'm typically using the term in a derogatory way, in that these people are typically closed-minded. They've typically made up their mind, and they're not interested in the facts. They would rather just have their belief. So, anyways, the other comments I want to make about experts are, and I alluded to this before, but I guess I want to be clear about this. Usually professional scientists have jobs doing science professionally, right? These people rely on a certain worldview. They rely on a certain scientific way that the world works. Almost all of their research depends on the world being a certain way. It depends on them believing that stuff. And so asking these people to put those beliefs in question is a tall order and is probably unreasonable. These people have built an entire life around their science, an entire reputation based on the research and scientific work that they've done. And to think that they could put that all in jeopardy because you want them to be open-minded and consider the facts and follow the data, probably unrealistic. All right? So you're probably not going to change that person's mind because they're going to be holding on to this thing so tight, because if they let go, they're letting go of a lot. All of a sudden, now they've been fired because they've started a scandal at NASA because they believe in the tooth fairy or whatever. These people can't allow themselves, they can't allow their reputation to be tarnished by the fact that they believe in something that's not materialistic. All right. So, there's one last thing I would say about these folks. Let's say you've come across someone who truly is open-minded and is truly looking at the facts and truly is going to give it a chance. There's a couple possibilities. One is they're not swayed by it. I mean, you've got your evidence, they've got their evidence, and they're not swayed. And you know what? For those people, you just tip your hat and you agree to disagree. Don't call each other names, and you move on. I mean, that's just the way it needs to be. I will say, though, that one last little thing that came to mind that, well, I don't want to blow the whole idea of my lectures by doing a spoiler, by giving away the end. So spoiler alert, I'm going to talk about this for just a second. One thing about all these scientists is that they share a common assumption that almost everyone in the world shares. And that assumption is that the universe, the world, the universe, the galaxy, everything is made up of physical matter. That is just a basic assumption. And it's a reasonable assumption based on what you get up and see every day and the objects that you interact with every day. It's reasonable for you to assume that we live in a material universe. So nobody questions that. No scientist is going to even question it. That's just taken as a given. Well, the problem is, it's very possible that assumption is wrong, is that we do not live in a material universe. It only seems like a material universe. And the point that I'm raising here is that even if a scientist has all good intention and looks at the data and still doesn't believe this stuff about the paranormal, the problem is they are still basing their entire worldview on what I believe is an incorrect assumption. And we need to spend hours more talking about this so that you can understand why I believe it's an incorrect assumption. And so I will just leave it at that and move on. Okay, there's a there's something that's going on in the world today, and this is true in every field of study, and that's specialization. It's true in business, it's true in science, it seems to be true everywhere. It's all about specialization. And I think specialization is one thing that that's having a negative impact on this whole issue of science's rejection of the paranormal. And so let me just give you a scenario. Let's say we can go back to the 19th century, 18th century, take your pick. And we're a scientist and we're studying the ecosystem at a pond behind our house. We're going to go out there with a magnifying glass and a few tools and maybe a couple of chemicals. Not a lot, because there wasn't much in the way of tools back then. And you would use your powers of observation to try to analyze what's going on in that environment. Back then, you would probably take a wide view of the environment. You'd look at the plant life. You'd look at the water. You'd understand the heat, the amount of heat being shined on the pond that's raising the temperature a few degrees, and you'd sort of make note of that. You'd make note of the particular botanical aspects of what's going on in the pond. You might catch a frog and dissect it and look at the brain and other physical attributes. Back then, typically it was a wide-ranging sort of jack of all trades kind of view of research, where you'd look at the big picture and all the individual pictures and understand how they all play in the big picture. Fast forward to the 21st century. You go out to that same pond, and maybe there's a couple of researchers out there. One of the researchers is looking at the feet of the frog or a toad or something to find out how it can stick to rocks and branches so well. And maybe they're on a grant from NASA to improve the gripper on a robot. And maybe there's someone else studying some algae. They're being paid by ExxonMobil to understand the algae in the pond so they can understand its energy potential. These people have scanning electron microscopes and mass spectrometers and all kinds of instruments and computers at their disposal, so they can really, like a laser beam, dig into the particular topic that's of interest to them. And they will certainly end up learning more about the specific detail that they're going after than their 18th century counterpart. But what they won't know is the bigger picture. The person dissecting the frog is not sitting there making drawings of the plant life, and is probably not studying other aspects of the pond that the 18th century scientists would have been studying. So we end up being ultra specialized because that's the only way we're able to make the advances we want to make in specific areas, right? But there's a price to be paid for that, and the price to be paid is we're left with very, very few generalists now. And the same is true in medicine, where there's a lot of specialists, not a lot of generalists. And the generalist is the person that you really want to talk to in terms of understanding or believing this paranormal work. If you're going to go to a Carl Sagan-like person, you're going to have a hard time finding that in this day and age because everyone is so ultra-specialized. All right? In the age of specialization, you end up with people who are a lot smarter in very narrow bands of information, but are not as smart in terms of the broad spectrum of science. And unfortunately, if you can't find someone with that broad spectrum, you're not going to be able to find someone who has the interest, the intellect, the background, the knowledge to be able to spend time really looking at the facts. And I would say the most important overriding issue that I've seen in a lot of these interviews of people being presented with paranormal experiences and asked to comment on them is that these people are just busy people. They've got busy lives. Their kids are doing what they're doing. Their wives are doing what they're doing. They've got a job. They're working 60 hours a week. They just simply don't have the time to spend to become expert in another field of study. There was a saying, I don't know where I came across this, but there's a saying that to become an expert on something takes 10,000 hours. Obviously, your mileage may vary, right? But 10,000 hours. I think I just ran a couple of quick numbers that said if you were spending time, say, working 5 hours a day on this stuff, 6 days a week, that's something like 5 years worth of work. Maybe it's 6 years, something like that. Well, that sounds about right. I've been doing this about, going on something like 9 years, and I feel like I've become somewhat expert in a lot of these fields in paranormal research and the metaphysical. And so, bottom line is, if it takes 10,000 hours to become somewhat expert in this field, then it's totally unreasonable to think that you could go to a physicist or any number of other, specific, science disciplines, take that expert and say, listen, take the time to really look at this and really become expert in it, and you'll see what I'm talking about. If you're really going to ask them to take 10,000 hours to do that, you're going to be disappointed because they're not going to do it. So what does that all translate to? Well, what it translates to is you're going to have to take a little bit more ownership of this thing than you want if you really want to get to the bottom of this. If you're really going to want to be able to ascertain whether this thing is true or possibly true, whether that's obviously bogus, if you're going to make those kinds of decisions, you're going to need to become a little bit more expert in some of the material. That's really what I'm doing in this lecture series, is to get you up to speed so that you may not be an expert at the end of this lecture series, but you'll be on your way. Actually, I think you'll have enough information if you combine this with a little bit of extra research to really start making your own decisions. I think you'll be more qualified after these 10 hours or so. You'll be more qualified than a lot of so-called experts that are out there, because you'll at least be familiar with the data. And I think that's the most important thing to be familiar with. All right? So that's really the point of this segment, is to get you to consider the possibility that you need to think about your beliefs, understand what it requires to acquire a new belief, and maybe this may require discarding an old one. You need to understand who you can trust and how to tell if you should trust their opinion. But the bottom line is, you really need to figure out how to get smarter yourself in terms of the facts, in terms of the data, in terms of the current state of research, so that you can start deciding yourself whether this is a belief that's worthy of letting into your home. All right? So that's it for Unit 1. The next unit is Unit 2, and we're going to talk about statistics and intention. So we'll be back to that in a few minutes.